The desert sun had dipped below the jagged mountaintops hours before, leaving only a dusky violet glow in its wake. Evening winds cooled the baked stones of the courtyard, and the air smelled faintly of orange blossoms carried from distant groves. Lyanna Stark stood by a broken fountain, its marble edges chipped and worn, the water stagnant in the basin. A single lantern flickered behind her, its flame dancing in a faint breeze that carried the promise of cooler night air. She was cloaked in a simple dress of dark wool, the color of midnight, unsuited to the warmth of dawn, but she had no other garments left. The day stretched long and lonely in this hidden keep, a secret haven nestled among the rocky foothills that rose like sentinels around them. She inhaled the foreign scents of the southern land, her heart heavy with yearning for the crisp pine forests and winter-cold winds of the north. Her fingertips glided across the marble lip of the fountain, where once water had streamed down in cheerful rivulets. Now it felt like everything else here, frozen in uncertainty, hushed by an uneasy hush. She had not wanted it to be like this, nor imagined it could end up so tangled. In her youth, Lyanna had dreamed of galloping across wide meadows and wading in cold streams with her brothers. She had dreamed of love too, though she'd never given her heart freely to girlish fantasies. If anything, she had been wild, impetuous even, and she had wanted freedom more than anything else. She recalled how the hot wind had whipped her hair when she rode in secret competitions, disguised and laughing, but those memories were as distant as the snows of Winterfell were now. A battered trunk with a few clothes, a lone sword, and the hush of empty hallways in this half-abandoned fortress. That was her life these days, miles and miles away from the roaring conflict that raged across the Seven Kingdoms. She felt the vibration of war through the reports that reached them at irregular intervals, a thunder in the distance that rattled her dreams. The realm was bleeding. All for her, some whispered. Dawn's twilight was foreign to Lyanna. The sun here set more dramatically than in the north, leaving the sky streaked with fierce oranges and pinks before it faded to a deep, dusky purple. Night-blooming flowers would soon release their delicate scent, and the dryness of the air made each fragrance more pronounced. She found it beautiful, yet the beauty was stained with guilt. How could she admire the hush of Dorne's nights when thousands died in battles she had helped ignite? It was not merely Robert's rebellion, nor the fight for the crown. It was a war fed by many flames, each sparked by secrets, by betrayals, by pride, and she was part of it, tethered to the beating heart of the conflict. She shifted her stance, noticing how the weight of her body felt different these days. She was not just Lyanna Stark anymore. She was two souls, perhaps, if one believed in such things. She had no illusions about her condition. Her cycle had stopped, her appetite had changed, her moods spiraled into unpredictable storms. Within her, a child grew. She placed a palm over her abdomen, feeling a ripple of shame and wonder all at once. Everything about this was a contradiction. She had come to care for Rhaegar Targaryen in ways she had not anticipated. Yet she loathed the destruction that his name, and by extension, her involvement with him, had unleashed upon the Seven Kingdoms. Sometimes she glimpsed in him the quiet poet, who had once played a harp by the trident, a man who spoke of prophecy and destinies. Other times she saw a prince overshadowed by the burdens of his birthright, determined to see a grand design in their union, heedless of the chaos it brewed. Was it love, or was it duty that had driven him? She had asked herself that question countless times, and each time, the answer eluded her. The fortress was nearly silent. The few guards left behind patrolled somewhere near the main gate. Their footsteps echoed faintly on stone walkways, a monotone reminder of the vigilance that surrounded her. Rhaegar was within these walls as well, somewhere behind the thick doors and corridors. She often felt him before she saw him, as though his presence cast a unique shift in the air. It was the quiet force of him, the austere dignity that came with being a Targaryen prince. Yet she had also seen him in unguarded moments, moments of tenderness, moments that made her heart ache with empathy. She thought of one such instance, how he had knelt by her bedside a fortnight ago, pressing a cool cloth to her brow when fever had seized her. He had watched over her, worry etched in his violet eyes. In those hours, she had slipped into a half-dream, images tumbling of a life in which the war had never happened, where she had never been betrothed to Robert, where Rhaegar had not been a prince, but merely a man with a harp. But the fever had passed, and with it went the illusions. The war was real, and it closed in around them like a tightening noose. She waited by the fountain, uncertain if she was expecting him, or hoping for solitude. The waters did not stir, and the courtyard's ancient stones glowed faintly under the sky's final glimmer of light. A dryness settled in her throat. She touched her hair, which had grown longer these past months, and exhaled slowly, imagining Winterfell's courtyard under moonlight. If she closed her eyes, she could almost hear the howling of wolves, the hush of snow-covered ramparts. It made her chest tighten with longing. She wanted to go home, but home was not as she had left it. Her father was dead. Her brother Brandon was dead. Her elder brother Ned was out there fighting, or so she believed, with Robert. She wondered if Ned had forgiven her. She prayed he might, someday, though she would never blame him for hating her. She had followed her heart to Rhaegar, or so she had believed, and that, whatever its intention, had ignited a storm none could quell. Footsteps behind her pulled her from her reverie. She turned to see Rhaegar approaching. His silver hair shimmered in the faint light as he emerged from the archway that led toward the Great Hall. He wore a simple tunic, unadorned save for the faint glimmer of a dragon sigil stitched at the collar. He had cast aside his armor for the evening, and in the gloom, he appeared almost ethereal, less a warrior prince, and more the scholar she had first heard stories of. He spoke her name softly, and she noticed the gentleness in his voice as he stepped close, regarding her with eyes that seemed burdened by regret. They exchanged few words. Often their conversations were stilted, weighed down by the knowledge of how many men had perished in the name of their bond. He extended a hand. She hesitated, but after a moment, she let him take hers. His grip was warm, and she could sense the tension in his fingers, like a subdued trembling. She wondered if he was thinking of the battles yet to be fought, or if he was merely afraid of losing her. He murmured that news had come from King's Landing. Unrest. The lords loyal to the crown were rallying anew, yet the rebellion's cause had grown stronger. The Trident had run red with blood in a great battle not long ago, and Rhaegar himself had ridden out to meet the rebels, only to return here under cover of night. That alone told Lyanna that the war was not going well for House Targaryen. She felt no triumph in that, only dread. Each lost life on either side weighed upon her, a debt she could not possibly repay. They spoke of trifles, as though trying to build a fragile bridge between them. He asked if she had rested, and she inquired about his men's provisions. They avoided the subject of war as much as they could, though it lurked in every shadow. When she glanced into his face, she saw a fleeting shadow of fear, and it caught her off guard. Rhaegar Targaryen was rarely fearful. Driven, yes. Somber, yes. Sometimes mournful in a quiet way. But tonight, fear flickered in his eyes. She realized it was not fear of the rebels or of losing his crown. It was fear that all he had done had led only to ruin. She could see the weight of that shame pressing down upon him. She might have pitied him. She did, in a way. But she could not ignore her own anger, the betrayal she felt at how the realm had been set aflame. She told him she needed air and pulled her hand from his. Without further explanation, she stepped away, out of the courtyard into a narrow corridor that curved around the inner wall. Torches sputtered in rusty brackets, casting dancing shadows along the stone. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She could sense him trailing behind, uncertain whether to follow or grant her space. She continued until she reached a small balcony overlooking the fortress's outer ramparts, where the night sky opened up before her. In the distance, a scattering of lights signaled some small Dornish town, though which it might be, she did not know. She leaned against the low parapet, feeling the rough texture of stone beneath her palms, and let the wind caress her face. The child within her stirred, a gentle reminder of the life she carried. A life that would shape the future of the realm for good or ill. He joined her, standing just far enough that their arms did not touch. She could sense him grappling with words, some confession or reassurance or plea. He seemed to settle on silence, and for a time, They both stared at the unbroken darkness that surrounded them. In that stillness, Lyanna found herself thinking of Robert Baratheon. She remembered his boisterous laugh, the fierce ardor in his eyes, how he would vow to break a man's skull if he dared insult her. She had not loved Robert the way he had loved her, but she had never wished for his destruction. She remembered his gift, a silvered looking glass that he said would help her see what a beauty she was. She had rolled her eyes at him, joking that it was he who fancied himself the beauty. That memory made her throat tighten. Now Robert was out there, scouring the kingdoms for Targaryens, his warhammer eager to crush them. If he knew she was alive in this place, if he knew the child she bore, he would not hesitate. It would be a conflagration beyond measure. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust. She faced Rhaegar. "How many must die for this?" she asked in a voice that quivered more than she intended. "How many more men will be slaughtered before there's no one left to claim a throne?" Her question lingered in the night air. She did not expect him to have an answer, and he did not. Not truly. He murmured something about prophecies, about the song of ice and fire, words that she had heard from him before. He said the child she carried was meant to be a fulfillment of something greater, that their union was no accident but a destiny woven into the tapestry of the realm. She wanted to scream at him that the realm did not bleed for a tapestry of prophecy. Fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, they died for politics, for crowns, for vengeance. Destiny, if such a thing even existed, felt hollow in the face of so much blood. She clenched her fists, arms trembling, and looked away. She wanted to be anywhere else. She wanted to hear Ned's voice telling her it would be all right, even if it was a lie. She wanted to ride away into the moonlight, never to be found by kings or lords, or any of their damned banners. But she was Lyanna Stark, and the child inside her was half Targaryen. Neither of them could escape the legacy that bound them. She heard Rhaegar exhale, a sound like resignation. He reached out again, and she let him place a hand on her shoulder. Though she felt no solace from his touch this time, she did not speak. There was no point in words. The moment frayed, and she pulled away once more, letting the silence speak volumes. Sleep came late that night, after she returned to the small chamber that served as her sleeping quarters. The bed was narrow, the walls thick and unadorned. A single candle flickered on the bedside table. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, recalling the glimpses of her brothers' faces, their laughter echoing from her memory. Time had stolen so much from them. Brandon, once so brash, gone forever. Benjen, now the only younger brother she had left. Ned, forced into leadership, forced into war. She thought of them all, her heart aching. A swirl of half-formed plans and deep-rooted fears kept her from drifting into restful sleep. A gnawing sense of responsibility tore at her. If only she could fix what she had set in motion. If only she had the power to end the killing. But what could she do but remain hidden, waiting for the child to come? The fortress felt like a cage, and she was the canary whose song beckoned only tragedy. She slept fitfully. In her dreams, she wandered a hallway lined with mirrors. Each mirror reflected a different fate. One showed her kneeling in a snowy courtyard, Ned and Robert glaring with betrayal. Another showed her holding a babe with silver hair, smiling as if the world were at peace. Yet another reflected a battlefield strewn with corpses, a crown of melted swords perched on a bloody dais. She turned and turned, but could not escape the reflections. When at last she woke in a sheen of sweat, the candle had burned down to a melted stub. Dawn light filtered through the narrow slit of a window. She rubbed her eyes, feeling exhaustion weigh down her limbs. There was a sour taste in her mouth, and she longed for the crisp chill of northern water to wash it away. She dragged herself from the bed, washing her face in a basin of lukewarm water. Her reflection in the rippling surface unsettled her. There were dark circles under her eyes, her cheeks looked thinner, and her hair was dull and tangle-prone. The glow of youth seemed to have dimmed, replaced by a hunted, hollow expression that she barely recognized. She saw a stranger looking back at her. A woman caught between duty and regret. She thought again of the child. Would the babe see her as a hero or a coward? Would she even live long enough to hold this child in her arms? The day unfolded slowly. She picked at her breakfast of bread and fruit, forcing herself to eat, though her stomach churned with anxiety. She took a short walk in the courtyard, feeling the heat climb as the sun rose higher. The place was deserted but for a few silent guards who paid her little mind. Beyond the high walls of this keep, the realm was burning. But here the quiet was unnerving. She recalled the words of her father about wars being decided by sword and flame, not by waiting in hidden corners. She felt like a bystander to her own life, caged by her own decisions. She made her way to a small library, an arched chamber lined with shelves that had once housed a modest collection of scrolls and tomes. Much of it was gone now, pilfered or relocated by the few Targaryen loyalists who traveled in and out of the fortress. She found a solitary book left behind, lying abandoned on a narrow table. Its cover bore the sigil of House Dane, and inside were scattered sketches of the Seven Kingdoms, half-finished genealogies, fragments of stories. She ran her fingertips over the drawings, lost in thoughts that trailed to Sir Arthur Dane, that legendary knight of the Kingsguard. She had glimpsed him once, tall and graceful, a sword of fabled brilliance at his side. He was not here now. He had left with Rhaegar on some matter a few weeks back, returning only briefly. Everything was shifting. Alliances and loyalties swirling in the storm of war. The Tower of Joy, they had called this place, though there was little joy to be found. As midday came, she lingered in the shade of the library, listlessly flipping through the pages of that battered book. The heat made her sweat, and she sipped water from a flagon left by one of the servants. Somewhere beyond these walls, the ravens carried messages of battles won or lost, of lords turning cloak, of armies on the march. Perhaps Ned was out there, forging alliances or besting the crown's forces. Perhaps Robert was near unstoppable, his hammer smashing through Targaryen lines. She pictured the swirl of Baratheon banners, the stag on a field of gold, and then she imagined the dragon of House Targaryen, red on black, locked in mortal combat. In the midst of it all lay the truth. None of these men truly cared for the small folk who bled and died in their name. War devoured them all. Her head throbbed. She set the book aside, pushing away from the table. She should have been used to the heat by now, but her body remained stubbornly northern. Her eyes ached from the glaring light, and her limbs felt leaden. She stepped out into the corridor and paused to collect herself, pressing the back of her hand to her forehead. A gust of warm air rushed past, carrying a swirl of dust motes. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the sense of dread would not leave. It seemed to swirl around her, inescapable, a black cloud of foreboding. A guard passed by, giving her a curt nod before continuing on his route. She wondered at the man's thoughts. Did he resent standing watch over the woman rumored to have seduced the prince and caused a bloody rebellion? Did he fear for his own life if the rebels should breach these walls? Did he pity her for the predicament she was in? She couldn't tell, and in truth, she did not want to know. She went the other way, following the corridor back to her room. She thought maybe she would try to rest again, though she doubted peace would come. Her mind churned with images of the war, and every so often the idea drifted through her thoughts that she had to do something. But what could she do? Surrender herself to Robert's men? Beg Rhaegar to abandon his claim? None of it seemed feasible. The Targaryen loyalists still believed Rhaegar was the rightful heir, and Robert's supporters would settle for nothing less than Targaryen blood. Caught between these two unstoppable forces, she felt as though she were trying to hold back a flood with her bare hands. She found her chamber door ajar. That was unusual, as she typically kept it latched. Stepping inside, she spotted Rhaegar at the small writing desk, poring over a letter. His hair caught the afternoon sun, giving it a sheen of white gold. He looked up at her approach, and for a moment, he appeared disarmed, as if he hadn't expected her so soon. She saw the letter in his hand bore the royal seal. A cold pit formed in her stomach. Another dispatch from King's Landing, most likely filled with dire tidings of the war. He rose, setting the parchment aside, and she noticed an intensity in his expression, as though he struggled to find the right words. Before he could speak, she asked, "What is it?" Her voice sounded flat in her own ears. She was too tired for pretense, too weary for half-truths. He exhaled, crossing to her with a measured stride. He spoke of new conflicts near Storm's End, how Mace Tyrell's host had laid siege to the castle. Robert was apparently fighting in the field, free as the wind, while his younger brother, Stannis, held Storm's End with dogged resolve. In the Riverlands, Ned Stark and Jon Arryn were mustering forces against what remained of the Crown's loyal armies. Rhaegar's father, the king, was entrenched in King's Landing, drifting further into madness, if the rumors were to be believed. The word wildfire slithered through conversation like a vile serpent. There were whispers that Aerys would torch the entire city before allowing it to fall to rebels. None of it surprised Lyanna, yet each tidbit stabbed at her like a blade. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. The kingdom was devouring itself, fracturing into chaos. As she gazed at Rhaegar, she realized with devastating clarity that he couldn't stop it. He had tried to quell tensions. He had tried to rally men to his banner and face Robert on the field of battle. But even a prince was but a single man, and the realm's wounds were too deep. She could see the frustration in his face, the flicker of uncertainty. He had always possessed a kind of quiet confidence, but now the cracks showed. This war might devour him as well. She asked about the letter. He hesitated, then told her that certain advisors in King's Landing believed that if she were revealed, her pregnancy, her presence with the prince, it might sway some lords back to Targaryen allegiance, perhaps out of reverence for an alliance between North and South. Lyanna almost laughed at the absurdity. Did these advisors believe that marriage or a child could gloss over the blood spill? She shook her head in disbelief, her own laugh harsh in her ears. That would only make Robert angrier, she said, rubbing her temple. She pictured Robert's fury, and it frightened her. She may not have loved him as he'd wanted, but she knew his temper. He would burn the whole of Dorne to reach her if he discovered she was here. She lifted her eyes to Rhaegar's. Promise me they won't use me as some piece in this game. I can't. Her voice cracked, raw emotion welling up. She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't know what she even wanted him to promise. That no harm would come to her child. That no more innocents would die. That, somehow, all this heartbreak could be undone? He knelt before her, hands resting lightly on her knees. She looked down, meeting his gaze. There was a tenderness there, a sorrow that mirrored her own. I never wanted a war, he said quietly, the line of his jaw tense. I wanted to do what was right for the realm. I believed. He broke off, as though the weight of his hopes and regrets strangled the words. His eyes flickered to her belly, and she felt a surge of conflicting emotions. A small part of her remembered why she'd fallen for him in the first place. His conviction, his dream of a better future. But the present was drenched in blood, and that overshadowed every dream. She reached out and touched his cheek, her gesture tentative. I know, she whispered, but we're here now. Those words felt like a death knell. We're here now. Past choices were irreversible. She thought of her father and brother, murdered by the king's madness. She thought of Ned, forced to shoulder a burden that was never meant to be his. She thought of Robert, who had once adored her, but now likely hated her as much as he hated the Targaryens. And she thought of the child growing inside her, an innocent who had no say in any of this. Rhaegar stood and moved away, crossing to the desk where the letter lay. He seemed lost in thought, one hand curled into a fist at his side. I ride out again soon, he said finally, his tone grim. We can't delay. My father. He trailed off, eyes closing as if the mention of Aerys caused him physical pain. He won't listen to reason. The lords who remain loyal to him do so out of fear or out of hatred for the rebels. There's talk he might. Again Rhaegar's words failed, but Lyanna knew what he meant. Madness. Fire. The Targaryen hallmark when cornered. Then don't leave me, she said, though the plea felt desperate, childish. She didn't even know if she truly wanted him to stay, or if she simply feared being left behind to wait out a war that might never end. But the thought of him returning to the battlefield, risking his life, risking the father of her child, terrified her. He looked at her, sorrow in his eyes, but also a resignation that told her he had no choice. Duty called him, as it always did. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging her fear, but also affirming there was no alternative. He would go, and soon. Their time here, for all its stifling oppression, was about to be cut short. She wondered if she would ever see him again once he rode away. The thought snaked through her heart, like a cruel whisper. In that moment, something hardened in her resolve. She had once been powerless, a mere pawn in a dance of kings and princes. But she was a Stark of Winterfell. She had a wolf's blood in her veins. And if there was any chance to halt this destruction, any chance at all, it would not come from continuing to play the powerless captive. That afternoon, she went about her routine as though nothing had changed. She strolled through the courtyard, took her midday meal in silence, and exchanged only brief words with Rhaegar. But inside, her mind churned with a plan she scarcely dared form. She told herself it was madness, that even the thought of it spoke to the desperation the war had bred in her. Yet it also offered a single glimmer of hope. If the war's greatest champion fell, would the bloodshed end? If the rebels could claim their vengeance, if Robert could triumph in full, perhaps the realm would be spared even greater catastrophe. Aerys would fall, and the Targaryen line would dissolve. Lyanna's heart twisted with dread at such a notion, for it meant severing the fragile bond she shared with Rhaegar. But was that bond worth thousands of lives? Each time she closed her eyes, she saw a battlefield strewn with bodies. She saw her brother Brandon's face, twisted in agony, recalled her father's death. She felt the child in her womb, stirring, innocent and unknowing. She had to consider the unthinkable. She could not bring herself to speak of it to anyone, not yet. She carried that burden quietly, letting it simmer in her thoughts. The idea was like a shard of ice lodged in her chest, sending chills through her veins every time she thought of it. She had never killed anyone. She had never harmed so much as a doe on a hunt, content to let the men chase their quarry while she rode for the thrill of speed and wind. But she was a Stark, and Starks were of the north, shaped by bitter winters and wolfish instincts. If this was the price to end the war, could she pay it? Evening came, and once again she found herself outside in the courtyard, darkness cloaking her as she leaned against the old fountain. She listened for the trickle of water but heard only silence. High above, a scattering of stars glimmered in the endless Dornish sky. The moon was a waning crescent, pale and thin. If she tilted her head, she could see a corner of the tower rising above her, a jagged silhouette against the sky. The fortress felt as though it held its breath, waiting for fate to unfold. Rhaegar would leave soon. He would gather what men he had left, ride north or east, trying to salvage his family's rule. She did not doubt his courage or his skill, but the tide of war was turning, and no prophecy could halt the steel of Robert's hammer or the cunning of Ned Stark's leadership. Rhaegar might die in battle anyway, but if he did not, if the war raged on, more innocents would perish. Aerys, in his madness, might burn King's Landing to ash. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost in a single blaze. The child in her womb would be born into a kingdom shattered by vengeance. Her heart pounded as she tried to quell the swirl of panic. This was not the future she wanted. A guard patrol passed by, but she was too lost in her thoughts to acknowledge them. The guard hesitated, as if to ask if she was all right, but then moved on. She tightened her jaw, telling herself she must be careful. She could not let her turmoil show openly. She began to pace across the courtyard's flagstones, her mind conjuring scene after scene, weighing consequences. If she killed Rhaegar, she would be a kinslayer in the eyes of some, a hero in the eyes of others. The child would still be half Targaryen, still a target for those who despised the dragon blood. Would Robert or Ned protect her then? Or would they shun her as a murderer, even if her victim was the man who had started the war? Her throat felt dry. She swallowed and forced a deep breath. Each day, the war claimed more lives. Each day, the hatred festered. If Rhaegar fell by her hand, quickly, quietly, she could deliver his body to the rebels, or at least ensure the knowledge of his death spread. Perhaps that would quell the fighting and save countless lives. Perhaps it would not. But she had to believe that removing Rhaegar would take the fire out of his loyalists, leaving only the Mad King in King's Landing. Would the lords unite against Aerys? Likely so. Even Targaryen loyalists must see the king was unfit to rule, and without Rhaegar to rally around, the crown would crumble swiftly. The realm might find peace. Cold, bitter peace, but peace nonetheless. She slumped onto the rim of the fountain, leaning forward, burying her face in her hands. The enormity of the act she contemplated threatened to crush her. She thought of the nights Rhaegar had knelt at her bedside, singing lullabies of old Valyria to soothe her nightmares. She thought of how he gently pressed his lips to her brow, promising a new dawn for their child. She thought of the half-smile he wore when speaking of a better world. And yet, the war had proved that idealism was not enough. There was a hardness in him too, a willingness to risk all for the sake of some grand vision. If that vision was doomed to fail, how many more would die in vain? She heard footsteps. Rhaegar again. He approached under the moonlight, his tunic loosened as if he'd been preparing for bed, his face drawn with worry. She looked up, and he saw the tears in her eyes. Without a word, he stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. She did not resist, but her entire body felt rigid, as though she were on the edge of a precipice. She wondered if he sensed what she was thinking. She doubted it. Rhaegar's mind was on the coming days, the battles to be fought, the father he feared, and the enemies who closed in. He probably saw her tears as grief for the realm, perhaps fear for him. He didn't know the depth of her resolve, how that very grief might push her to do something that would echo through the ages. He knelt beside her. The courtyard torchlight danced across his features, illuminating the lines of fatigue etched into his brow. She realized he too was but a mortal man burdened by a king's destiny. How easy it was to forget that. He murmured something gentle, calling her his love, promising that he would end the war soon, that they would raise their child in a realm redeemed. She looked into his eyes, and for a heartbeat, she longed to believe him. She imagined a future in which the conflict ended with a truce, in which Targaryen Starks somehow set aside old grievances. But her mind conjured the savage reality of Robert's hatred, the unstoppable tide of Ned's righteous anger. She recalled the small folk who starved as armies trampled their field. She thought of the charred remains of towns sacked by knights loyal to one side or the other. It all felt irreparable. She did not speak, fearing her voice would betray too much. Instead, she reached out and touched his cheek, leaning in so their foreheads touched. She shut her eyes, savoring the warmth of him, the gentleness that first attracted her to him. For a moment, they stayed like that, hearts pounding in the quiet courtyard. Then she drew back, letting the cool night air fill the space between them. He nodded, as if accepting her need for solitude, and rose to his feet. With one last glance, he moved away, disappearing into the shadows of an archway. She sat there a moment longer, the child within her shifting subtly. It was decided then, though she had not uttered the words aloud. If no one else could end this war, she would do it herself. She would bear the guilt, bear the loathing of the realm if it came to that. But she could not watch more families ripped apart because of her supposed destiny. A measure of calm settled over her like a cold cloak. She was Lyanna Stark, daughter of Winterfell, and the war would claim no more of her kin, even if it cost her own soul. Even if it meant snuffing out a man she had once thought she loved. She would do it. She had to. The realm deserved peace, or at least a chance at it. She slipped away into the night, returning to her chamber to think on how to proceed. The fortress was not heavily guarded. Rhaegar trusted too easily, perhaps because he believed in the righteousness of his cause. Or perhaps he never imagined Lyanna would harm him. The thought made her chest tighten. She told herself that if it spared countless lives, it was worth it. But it would be a betrayal he could never foresee, one that might haunt her till her dying day. She felt a tear trail down her cheek and brushed it away angrily. A single tear was not enough to wash away the blood that already stained her hands by proxy. Once in her chamber, she barred the door and lit a single candle. The warm glow flickered against the stone walls. She thought of her brothers, and a semblance of fierce pride blossomed in her chest. She was not a pawn. She was a Stark. Starks endured. Snow might bury the world, but the pack survived together. By protecting one another, by doing what must be done, no matter the cost. The notion pulsed in her mind, mingling with the memory of Rhaegar's somber eyes. She knew he dreamed of a golden age for Westeros, but the war had turned that dream to dust. The child in her womb would perhaps inherit that dream, or perhaps inherit the nightmares left behind. She sank onto the bed, feeling the chill of realization sink into her bones. The final step she planned was monstrous, yet so was the war. She gazed at the candle's flame, small yet resilient against the darkness. How fragile was life, how easily snuffed out. War was the mother of sorrow, and in this land of broken hearts, perhaps an act of mercy could look like a crime. She would not act tonight, or even tomorrow. She would wait, watch, and choose her moment. But the moment would come, and when it did, Lyanna Stark would do what had to be done, for the sake of all the realms of men. She lay back, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion claimed her. Dreams found her again, swirling with ominous portents and flashes of steel. She awoke once near midnight, heart pounding, convinced she had heard a dragon's roar echo in the corridor. But it was only the wind. She sat up, pressing a hand to her racing heart, then forced herself to breathe slowly. The child within her twisted, like it sensed her anguish. She hushed it with a trembling hand over her stomach, murmuring a soft reassurance into the darkness. She did not know if it was for the baby or for herself. Dawn came slowly, the sky shifting from black to charcoal gray, then to a murky indigo. She rose, washed her face, and braided her hair as best she could, hands shaking slightly. She forced herself to eat a small portion of bread and cheese, ignoring the knot in her belly. Outside, the fortress began to stir, guards changing shift, a few stable hands leading horses out to a makeshift paddock. The day began like any other. No one suspected a thing. She wandered through the corridors, passing Rhaegar's door. It was closed. She paused, half tempted to slip inside and see if he slept. But she moved on, heading to the courtyard where the desert air greeted her with a still, hot hush. By mid-morning, the sky was ablaze with sunlight. She found a patch of shade near the old fountain, her thoughts circling around the single question. How would she do it? She had never wielded a blade in true combat, never spilt blood, but she had grown up around swords. She knew how to hold one, how to strike. She pictured it in her mind, again and again, the moment she'd slip a dagger between his ribs. She tried to picture his face. Would it be shock? Betrayal? A quiet acceptance? Her stomach churned. Guilt lanced through her, but she clenched her jaw. The war demanded a sacrifice. Better his life than the lives of thousands more. The hours wore on. Servants passed, offering food or water, but she refused them with a weak smile. She felt cold despite the heat. Her nerves frayed with each second, the monstrous idea entrenched in her mind. She was not ready. She might never be, but she told herself that when the time came, she would seize her courage and do what she must. For the realm, for her family, for her child. So she waited, letting the hours pass like a slow river of dread. She had no illusions that she would emerge from this unscathed, but she clung to the hope that others might live, that the wheels of war might finally slow. And so Lyanna Stark sat in silence by the dead fountain, trapped in the hush of a hidden fortress under the scorching Dornish sun. Her heart torn between love and duty, between the bond she once cherished, and the realm she once cherished, and the realm she yearned to save. She told herself that she would be a sword for peace, no matter how bloody that peace had to be, and she prayed, in the quiet corners of her mind, that the gods would forgive her. Now, Lyanna woke before dawn, dragging herself from restless sleep into the quiet gloom of her chamber. The walls were stone, cold despite the Dornish heat, and she felt the child within her twist as she sat up. A single candle sputtered on the small bedside table, throwing unsteady shadows across the floor. Outside, the fortress lay in its nightly hush, but in her mind, the war raged louder than ever. She felt a heaviness behind her eyes, a testament to the worry that had kept her awake into the small hours. Already she could smell the dryness of the desert wind, taste the dust that seemed to settle on her tongue whenever she breathed. She washed her face in tepid water. Her reflection wavered in the basin, the slight distortion making her features appear gaunt, almost haunted. The tangle of her hair felt rough against her fingertips. Sometimes she barely recognized the woman she'd become in these lonely months. She was neither the spirited girl who'd once galloped through Winterfell's courtyards, nor the bright-eyed dreamer who'd believed love could change the world. Here, in this sun-scorched refuge, she was something else altogether. A desperate soul weighed down by guilt, and torn between a lingering affection for the man she had followed, and the knowledge that his death might be the realm's only chance at peace. She slipped into a simple gown. The dark wool clung to her, already too heavy for the growing warmth. But she had no alternative. Her garments were remnants of a life that no longer fit. In the early light, she pulled her hair into a low tail, leaving a few loose strands to frame her face. She told herself she would eat a meager breakfast, then wander into the courtyard as always, wearing that thin mask of calm so no one would suspect her true purpose. A faint sound alerted her, a soft knock on the door. She crossed the small chamber, unbolted the latch, and opened it to find a young serving girl, brown-haired, barefoot, with wary eyes. The girl held a wooden tray. On it rested a hunk of bread, a bowl of pottage, and a small clay cup of watered wine. Lyanna felt her stomach roil at the thought of food, but she forced a cordial smile, murmured thanks, and accepted the meal. The girl hesitated, as if wanting to say something, but no words came. After a second, she dipped her head and hurried off down the corridor. Lyanna set the tray on the small writing table, staring at the steam curling up from the pottage. Her appetite was weak, but she owed it to the child within her to eat. She took a few spoonfuls and forced them down, swallowing against the dryness in her throat. She tore a piece of bread and slowly chewed, letting her gaze wander around the chamber's sparse furnishings. The bed, the desk, a single chair, and a small chest holding what few garments she possessed. In the corner, the candle's flame danced, nearly burned down to a stump. She thought about how to proceed. She knew that Rhaegar would be preparing to ride out soon. He'd mentioned it the night before, haltingly, as if he dreaded the conversation. He was still clinging to hope of a decisive victory, even after the Trident's horrors. She could see the weariness in him, the toll of balancing loyalty to his father with the dream of a better realm. Yet he was resolved to lead men again, to face Robert, Ned, and the rebels in open battle. It was all or nothing now, a final bid to salvage his family's legacy. Lyanna felt her chest constrict at the thought that soon, she would no longer have the chance to stop him. If indeed she truly possessed the courage to do this monstrous thing. She ate until she could stand no more, then set the tray aside. Rising, she unlatched her door and stepped into the hallway. Torches burned low, their light competing with the dawn's soft glow creeping through the windows. A guard in Targaryen livery walked by, giving her a courteous nod. She responded with a slight dip of her head, hiding the whirlwind in her mind. Her palms felt clammy. She imagined how easy it might be to simply walk away, slip out of the fortress, under the cover of darkness, and vanish into the desert. Yet she knew the child in her womb would not fare well on such a flight. And besides, it would do nothing to end the war. If she ran, war's jaws would continue to devour thousands. Everything in her life led back to a single, tragic conclusion. She must act. She descended a short flight of stairs that opened into a small courtyard. Daylight filled it, though the sun had not fully lifted above the fortress walls. The fountain's basin sat still and stale, a reminder of how deserted this place felt, an echo of past glories. Once, Dornish lords might have entertained guests here, letting water splash and sparkle amid laughter. Now only ghosts lingered. She felt them as she crossed to a crumbling pillar, leaning her back against the warm stone. A guard or two was posted near the gateway, but otherwise, the space was hers alone. She closed her eyes and let the sun brush her eyelids. The day would be hot. She could feel the relentless press of heat already. The dryness sapped her strength, drawing the sweat from her pores. She shifted her weight, trying to ease a dull ache in her lower back. The child was not yet large enough to cause her much burden, but she felt each day keenly. The tightening of her belly, the pangs that sometimes shot through her if she moved too quickly. She tried to imagine the babe's face, though all she could conjure was a swirl of silver hair and gray eyes. The child would be of both worlds, half Stark, half Targaryen. She wondered if that dual heritage could ever find harmony in a realm so steeped in hatred and violence. She sensed movement behind her and turned. Rhaegar appeared, stepping out from the shadow of an archway with a quiet grace. He wore light armor over a padded jerkin, the chest plate embossed with the three-headed dragon of his house. A sword belt was slung low on his hips, though the scabbard was empty. She guessed his blade must be in the armory or near the stables, waiting until he departed. His face looked pale, as though he'd slept no better than she had. A fleeting pang of sorrow rippled through her. She remembered his gentler moments, playing a harp or reading from some ancient tome of prophecy. Here stood a warrior, yet within him still lay the poet who believed in songs of ice and fire. She braced herself, fighting the urge to pity him too much. Soon, if her plan succeeded, that poet's song would be silenced forever. He approached, offering a tentative smile. She gave him a slight nod, uncertain what to say. They stood together in that courtyard, the tension between them thick enough to taste. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I was looking for you. I wanted us to talk before." He hesitated, glancing away. "Before I make ready to ride out." She folded her arms, hugging herself. "You've decided then?" He nodded. "I must. There's word Robert's forces are advancing again, pushing closer to the capital. My father, the city." He paused, and she recognized the anguish in his eyes. They both knew Aerys's madness grew by the day. Rhaegar's voice was hushed. "If I don't act, the city could burn. I can't let that happen." She studied him, trying to keep her voice calm. "You think riding out with a handful of men will stop Robert from destroying your father's kingdom? He's been on your family's end." Rhaegar exhaled. "Perhaps. But if I meet him in the field, if I can broker any sort of truce." She almost laughed at the absurdity, though it came out as a harsh breath. "Robert won't parley. He wants your head." He ran a hand through his silver hair, tension radiating from him. "I know," he said softly, "but there are other lords, other forces at play. Some might rather see me on the throne than my father. If I can unify them, turn them against Aerys's extremities, perhaps." He trailed off, clearly aware of how slim this hope was. She looked away, her eyes finding the empty basin of the fountain. "You'd risk your life and the lives of your men on that chance?" "I would," he answered, voice firm. "I have to try. I can't sit idle while the realm crumbles." She couldn't argue with him. Part of her even admired the resolve. But it only solidified her conviction that he would never abandon this quest for a better world, even if the cost was too high for anyone to bear. And so, she felt the familiar coil of dread in her stomach. He would ride out, and thousands more might die. If she was to prevent that, she couldn't hesitate. Time slipped through her fingers like sand. He brushed a gentle hand across her cheek. "I'm sorry," he whispered, searching her face for a trace of forgiveness or understanding. "I know how much you've lost because of all this. I never wanted." She stiffened, stepping back. The contact made her heart twist with guilt, but she forced herself to maintain composure. "None of us wanted it," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "But wanting or not wanting doesn't matter anymore." He withdrew his hand, the softness in his expression replaced by a flicker of regret. "I'll leave 2 of my Kingsguard here to see you're safe." "I wish I could stay," he said, gaze lingering on her belly. "Truly I do." She swallowed hard and nodded. "I know," she managed, her voice unsteady. The child stirred within her, as if sensing the tumult in its mother's mind. She exhaled slowly, pressing a hand over her abdomen. "Just come back alive," she said, surprising herself with how genuine it sounded. Even if she intended to end his life by her own hand, something inside her could not bear the thought of him falling on the battlefield, cut down in some nameless carnage. He inclined his head, uncertain whether to be grateful or troubled by her words. "I will try," he said softly. Then he turned and left the courtyard, his steps echoing in the stillness. She watched him go, torn by a tempest of conflicting emotions. She leaned against the pillar again, letting the weight of her choice settle like a cold stone in her gut. The hours passed in a kind of hazy limbo. She paced the courtyard, passing under the scorching sun until she felt dizzy from heat. She retreated indoors, drank water in the keep's small library, thumbed aimlessly through half-burned scrolls, not actually reading the words. At intervals she would pause and listen, half expecting to hear the clang of swords or the trumpet of horns announcing Rhaegar's departure. Each time, she felt her pulse quicken. Part of her wanted to rush to his side, to beg him to stay, if only so that she might spare herself this terrible act. But she knew he wouldn't listen. His sense of duty was unbreakable, and if she did nothing, the war would go on, perhaps even intensify. By mid-afternoon, she saw men in Targaryen colors leading horses from the stables. Dull metal glimmered off lances, swords, and breastplates. The fortress bustled with hurried preparations, guards calling out, stable hands fetching saddles, a pair of knights checking their mounts. Lyanna lingered at a high window overlooking the courtyard, the shutters thrown open to let in a tepid breeze. She watched Rhaegar appear, fully armored except for the helmet tucked under his arm. He moved among the men, inspecting gear, exchanging final words, offering instructions for the knights who would remain. She caught sight of Sir Oswell Went, tall and silent at the prince's flank, and Sir Gerald Hightower, the pale bull, conferring with another knight about the route they would take. The others, whose names she barely knew, seemed tense, hurrying to be ready. She forced herself to breathe evenly. If Rhaegar rode away now, the moment for her to act would vanish. The entire reason she had steeled her courage was slipping through her grasp. She rested a hand on the window's worn sill, her mind racing. If she let him leave, her chance might be gone forever. Then the war would ride on, unstoppable. She swallowed hard, feeling sweat trickle down the back of her neck. She had no illusions that she could make a difference once he was on the road with his Kingsguard. Perhaps she could find him in the night, but the risk would be greater. Here, in the fortress's hush, they were alone, the men mostly occupied with their duties. Here, she might catch him off guard. She hated the thought. Her body tensed as if rejecting the monstrous act. But what alternative existed? She tore herself away from the window and hurried along the corridor, the flickering torchlight guiding her toward the small armory. She remembered the place from an earlier exploration, a cramped chamber near the courtyard's far side, where a handful of spare weapons lay stored. She needed something light enough to conceal or wield quickly, something lethal but not unwieldy in her untrained hands. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she turned a corner, skirted past a pair of servants, and found the door. Inside, the armory was dim, lit by two narrow windows high on the wall. A few racks held spears, swords, and shields. On a small table near the back, she spotted a collection of daggers. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She crept forward, mindful of any footsteps outside, her gaze darting around. The air smelled of oiled metal and dust. Carefully, she selected a short dagger, its blade single-edged, the hilt wrapped in plain black leather. She tested the weight in her palm, swallowing a lump in her throat. This could kill a man, she reminded herself. This could kill Rhaegar. She forced herself not to dwell on the image of his face as she slid the dagger's sheath into the folds of her gown, securing it to her belt beneath the fabric. She drew the cloak closer around herself, hoping no one would notice the subtle bulge. Her heart pounded so loudly, she thought the entire fortress might hear it. She stepped away from the table, forcing a calm expression onto her features, then slipped back out of the armory, shutting the door with care. The corridor felt oppressively hot, or perhaps it was her own fear causing her to flush. She wiped her brow and headed toward the courtyard. As she neared the arched entrance, she could hear men speaking in hushed yet urgent tones, and the sounds of horses shifting restlessly. The courtyard opened before her. Rhaegar stood at the center, speaking quietly to Sir Oswell Went. A group of knights lingered, adjusting buckles, distributing water skins, and checking saddlebags. The day's glare made everything painfully bright, and Lyanna squinted as she approached. She was not entirely sure how she would isolate him, but desperation guided her steps. She waited until Sir Oswell stepped away, then crossed toward Rhaegar. Her pulse thundered in her temples, and she fought to keep her hands from trembling. He glanced up at her approach, eyes shadowed beneath the silver hair that clung to his brow in the heat. For a moment, no words formed in her mind. She just stared at him, taking in every line of his face, every inch of the armor that seemed to swallow his lean frame. She remembered how, once she had looked on that armor with admiration and fear, a symbol of his princely birth. Now it was a barrier between them. The thing that made him seem not just a man, but an embodiment of a cause. He gave a slight bow of his head, a courteous gesture that felt strangely formal. "I was coming to find you," he said, voice low. "I'm leaving within the hour." She swallowed, willing herself to speak. I need a moment alone with you," she managed, forcing the strength into her voice. "Before you go." He studied her face, curiosity and concern mingling. Then he nodded. "Come," he said, placing a hand at her elbow. "We can go inside to the solar." She nodded, letting him guide her away from the courtyard. She could feel the dagger pressing against her side, and she prayed no keen-eyed guard would spot the uneven drape of her cloak. Her breath was shallow, chest tight. She prayed she had the nerve to do this. The fortress seemed brighter, sounds sharper, as if her senses had heightened in anticipation of the unthinkable. They walked through an arched doorway into a narrow hallway lined with old tapestries. At the far end stood a small solar, a chamber with a few chairs, a desk, and tall windows that overlooked the rocky Dornish landscape. Inside, the air felt slightly cooler, the walls thick enough to block out some of the sun's heat. Rhaegar closed the door behind them, the latch clicking softly. She heard her own heartbeat thrumming in her ears, and her palms were damp. He turned to her, a solemn look on his face. "You've been distant," he said, voice soft but tinged with worry. "I know these are dark times, but you seem—" He did not finish the sentence, searching her eyes instead. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm afraid," she admitted, letting the truth slip out in a trembling voice. "Afraid for my family, for what might happen if you fail. If Robert marches on King's Landing." "Afraid for?" Her voice caught. She was not certain if she was stalling or genuinely pouring out her fears. Perhaps both. He touched her arm gently. "I won't let him harm you," he said, conviction threading through his voice. "Nor the child." She almost laughed again at the naivety. "If you die, you can't protect anyone," she whispered. Her pulse hammered, a warning drumbeat in her head. The dagger felt impossibly heavy, strapped beneath her cloak. The moment to strike was now before he left, before he donned his helmet or mounted his horse. Another few minutes, and the courtyard would swarm with knights. She might never get him alone again. Her lips felt numb, but she forced the words out. "Stay," she pleaded, voice raw. "Stay here with me, at least until the child is born. Please." He shook his head slowly, regret painfully clear in his eyes. "I can't, Lyanna," he said, voice resonant with sorrow. "I know what's at stake for you, for me, for the child. But I can't abandon the realm to my father's madness. If I don't lead these men, no one else can unify them. Robert will tear the kingdom apart, or my father will burn it. I won't let either happen." She inhaled a shaky breath, every nerve in her body aflame. "Then you're choosing the realm over us," she said, allowing a flicker of bitterness to show. "Over me." He bowed his head. "If I succeed, there will be a place for us, a realm I can rebuild. If I fail—" He hesitated, the enormity of that failure clear in his eyes. He lifted a hand, brushed his thumb gently across her cheek, wiping away a tear she did not realize had fallen. "I do love you," he said softly, almost like an apology. She swallowed, the next breath almost a sob. She clutched at his wrist, pressing her face to his palm. Time seemed to slow. Her other hand moved to the concealed dagger at her hip, slipping beneath the cloak. She felt the hilt's coarse leather under her fingertips. Could she do this while gazing into his eyes, feeling the warmth of his touch? Another wave of doubt crashed over her, threatening to paralyze her. But she thought of Ned, of Brandon, of her father. All gone. She thought of the thousands who would perish if Rhaegar pressed on with his war. She thought of King's Landing, of wildfire stashed beneath the city. of innocence who would burn alive in the name of a mad king's twisted final stand. She clenched her jaw, her grip tightening on the dagger hilt. She tried to form words, but all that came was a strangled sound. Rhaegar's expression flickered with alarm, as if sensing her distress. He started to pull back, maybe to ask if she needed a maester, but before he could speak, she lurched forward. With trembling determination, she yanked the dagger free and pressed it against the seam of his armor, where the plates overlapped near his ribs. She felt the metal connect, but the angle was awkward. The blade skittered off the armor, not piercing cleanly. Panic surged through her. She twisted the dagger, desperate to find a gap. His eyes flew wide, shock and confusion flooding his features. He tried to step away, but she lunged, forcing her shoulder into him. Her entire body trembled with adrenaline, tears blurring her vision. The point of the blade slid beneath a plate, the friction horrible against her ears. She felt it bite flesh. For an instant, she couldn't breathe. His mouth opened in a silent gasp, and he staggered back, pain contorting his face. Yet the blow was not as certain as she had hoped. The armor had deflected some of the force. He grunted, reaching for her wrist in a reflex to push her away. She let out a choked sob, yanking the blade free in a spatter of red. He staggered against the nearby table, breathing ragged. Blood began to seep, staining the metal of his breastplate. She could see the shock in his eyes, the betrayal. She couldn't stand to look, but she made herself. Another chance. She had to strike again. If she faltered, if she left him merely wounded, it would all be for nothing. He tried to speak, but all that came was a hoarse rasp. His hand fumbled at his sword belt, but it was empty. The sword was out in the courtyard, lying with the rest of his gear. He turned, maybe aiming to grab anything within reach. An old candlestick, a chair, to defend himself. Lyanna felt the child in her womb twist violently, as though sensing the carnage. She forced herself to move, stepping forward, tears streaming down her cheeks. She plunged the dagger toward his torso again, near the gap in the armor. He managed to get a forearm in the way, and the blade caught his flesh with a sickening slice. Blood splattered across her hand, warm and shocking. A cry of agony left his lips, echoing off the chamber walls. She nearly dropped the dagger, revulsion and heartbreak colliding in her mind. But she recalled the burn of her father's execution, the swirl of madness in King's Landing, the fields where men lay rotting after battles waged in her name. This must end. She pressed forward, a ragged sob tearing from her throat, and drove the dagger again, a desperate, clumsy thrust. This time, the blade found the vulnerable space beneath his arm. His cry cut off in a ragged gasp, and he fell to his knees. Blood poured out, staining the floor. She stood there, panting, hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the weapon. He stared at her, eyes full of pain, and something worse, disbelief, heartbreak, perhaps a last flicker of devotion. His lips moved, shaping words she could not hear. A gush of crimson bubbled at the corner of his mouth. She wanted to scream, to run, to take it all back, but it was too late. She forced herself to kneel beside him, heart in her throat. A swirl of anguish blinded her. He opened his mouth, managing a faint whisper. Lyanna, the sound of her name on his lips, broken and laced with hurt, shattered what little composure she had. She dropped the dagger with a clatter, cradling his head in her hands despite the blood. She sobbed, feeling the hot stickiness coating her fingers. He tried to speak again, but the words dissolved into a wet cough. Then his eyes rolled back, and the tension in his body slackened. She felt him go, still in her arms. A keening wail tore from her throat, echoing in the small solar like a lament for every life lost in this senseless war. She clung to him, hardly aware of her own breath, lost in a tempest of regret so vast she thought it might kill her on the spot. Footsteps pounded outside, voices rising in alarm. Her dagger had not been quiet, and Rhaegar's cry of pain must have reached the corridor. She looked up, terror electrifying her. If the guards found her like this, would they kill her on sight? Or would they take her captive, exact a more brutal vengeance? She remembered, in a flash of delirious panic, that she was still wearing the Targaryen prince's blood all over her hands. A wave of dizziness hit her, her lungs seizing as though starved for air. The door burst open, and Sir Oswell appeared, sword drawn. Behind him pressed Sir Gerald Hightower and 2 guards, alarm plain on their faces. They saw Lyanna crouched over Rhaegar's body. Sir Oswell's gaze darted to the bloody dagger on the floor, then to the slick crimson on Lyanna's hands. Horror flooded his expression. "Seven, save us!" he gasped, rushing forward. Sir Gerald barked an order for the guards to hold, though they looked ready to run her through. Lyanna staggered to her feet, stepping back as Sir Oswell knelt beside his prince. She stared, blank, as he pressed a hand over the wound, but she could see from his frantic expression that it was futile. Rhaegar was gone. That last ragged breath had escaped him in her arms. Sir Gerald turned to her, jaw clenched, eyes blazing with shock and fury. "What have you done?" he hissed, voice quavering with a grief that matched his anger. She found no words. What could she possibly say? She stood there, trembling, tears still coursing down her cheeks. She felt the child move inside her, a sick irony that life still flourished within her, even as Rhaegar's blood pooled on the stone floor. She tried to form a sentence, an explanation, a plea, but nothing came. All she had was a grief-stricken stare. Sir Gerald signaled to the guards, and they moved in, seizing her arms. She did not resist. Her strength seemed to have left her entirely, as though the dagger's blow had stabbed her soul as well. She barely registered the feeling of rough hands on her, barely heard the outraged cries that echoed from the hallway. The air smelled like iron and dust, and her vision blurred at the edges, threatening to swallow her in darkness. Sir Oswell's voice carried through the haze, shouting for a maester, though it was clear Rhaegar no longer needed one. Amid the confusion, she felt herself pulled away, dragged from the solar into the corridor. She blinked, breath hitching, trying to focus as the knights barked orders. A swirl of movement surrounded Rhaegar's fallen form. Some men rushed to kneel at his side, others backed away in horror or disbelief. For an instant, Lyanna caught a glimpse of Rhaegar's still face, and it felt like the world had split in two. Then she was jolted forward as the guards shoved her down the corridor. She stumbled, nearly collapsing, but they kept her upright. Her body felt boneless, her mind numb, as though she had stepped outside herself. Something she had never imagined possible had happened. She had killed Rhaegar Targaryen, the man who'd crowned her with winter roses, who'd spoken of love and prophecies, who had fathered the child growing inside her. The enormity of it threatened to crush her, but she told herself that she had done this to save the realm, to stop a war that had already stolen so much. She had done it for Ned, for Brandon, for all those who would otherwise die. Yet the justification seemed hollow as she gazed at her blood-stained hands. They hauled her to the fortress's lower level, where cells awaited. Most were used for storage, but at least one was kept locked, thick iron bars sealing in a cramped space. The guards shoved her inside without ceremony. She staggered over the threshold, almost falling to her knees. The door clanged shut behind her, and the heavy lock clicked. She heard muffled curses from outside, the men's voices clashing with confusion and anger. She could not muster the will to move. She sank against the stone wall, hugging her arms around herself. A wave of nausea tightened her stomach. Her mouth tasted bitter, and her throat felt raw. Time lost meaning. She wasn't sure if minutes or hours passed as she sat on the cell's rough floor, eyes unfocused, replaying the moment of Rhaegar's last breath over and over in her head. At some point, she noticed her hands, still sticky with his blood, and a rush of revulsion forced her to retch. She crawled to a corner, heaving until there was nothing left in her stomach but bile. The child twisted again, a reminder of her reality. She tried to breathe through it, though each inhalation felt like a knife in her ribs. Footsteps approached, and she heard the scrape of metal on metal as someone unlocked the cell door. 2 knights entered, their faces grim. She recognized them as Sir Oswell Went and Sir Gerald Hightower. Both wore expressions etched with a bitterness that verged on despair. She expected them to drag her out and sentence her to death on the spot. Perhaps she even welcomed that swift end. Instead, Sir Gerald spoke, his voice eerily calm despite the tremor beneath. "Why?" he demanded, eyes burning with suppressed fury. "Why would you do such a thing?" She lifted her head, meeting his gaze with hollow eyes. She thought she should answer, but the words stuck in her throat. When she did speak, her voice was fractured, each syllable rasping against her raw throat. "To end it," she whispered. "He would have fought and fought. More would die. She stopped, tears renewing their course down her cheeks. Sir Oswell looked away, anguish tightening his features. "He was our prince," he said, voice quivering. "He trusted you. He loved you." She closed her eyes, fresh waves of shame crashing over her. "And I cared for him, but..." She forced her eyes open, meeting theirs, even though they stared at her as if she were a monster. "This war, my father, my brother. He was going to keep fighting. I had to stop him." The words came out in a desperate rush, as if explaining the unexplainable could lessen the weight of her guilt. Sir Gerald's jaw worked, but he remained silent for a moment, hand flexing on the hilt of his sword. She almost thought he might strike her then and there, but he merely closed his eyes, struggling to contain the roiling grief. "The king," he exhaled, voice cracking. "He will demand your head, and the child's, if he knows." A tremor shot through her. Aerys was still king in name, if not in sanity. Rhaegar had been the only one holding his father's madness at bay. Now that was gone. She realized with a sick twist of horror that she had indeed ended Rhaegar's campaign, but in doing so, might have freed Aerys to do something even more horrific. Her mind reeled at the possibility that she'd made things worse. She turned her gaze to the knights, desperation shining in her eyes. "Then let me go," she whispered, though she knew how foolish it sounded. "If the war sees that Rhaegar is dead, maybe Robert will." Sir Gerald cut her off. "You think to end the war by slaying the rightful prince? You think the rebels will simply lay down arms? They'll come for the king, and he'll burn them all." The quake in his voice revealed fear as much as fury. She shook her head, tears spattering the stone floor. "I don't know," she said, raw with regret and exhaustion. "I just wanted it over. I couldn't live with more blood on my account." Sir Oswell's face twisted, rage contorting his features. He advanced toward her, forcing Lyanna to shrink back against the wall. "You've spilled the blood of a prince," he spat. "There'll be a reckoning. Aerys will want vengeance, if the rebels don't get to you first." His gaze flicked to her abdomen, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "And that child, gods have mercy on us." She pressed her palms over her belly, protective instinct flaring. She saw the conflict in Sir Oswell's eyes, the struggle between duty and compassion. He was Kingsguard, sworn to protect the royal family, but the woman before him had just murdered the heir to the throne. Did that make the child inside her a threat or something to be defended? She saw no easy resolution in his face. A heavy silence fell. Eventually, Sir Gerald turned to Sir Oswell, his voice lower. "We lock her up for now. No one sees her. We await word from King's Landing. Let the king decide her fate." He sounded resigned, as though deferring to a monstrous authority he could not disobey. Sir Oswell gave a curt nod, though he threw Lyanna a look filled with loathing. Without another word, they exited the cell, slamming the door behind them. She was left in darkness once more, the chill of the stones seeping through her bones. She slumped onto the floor, drained of all energy, her tears finally spent. She laid a trembling hand over her belly and closed her eyes. If Aerys decided her fate, what chance did she or her child have? She recalled the stories of his cruelty, the fates of those he deemed traitors, the memory of her father's execution, the wildfire that had consumed the man who served as her father's companion, the agony that had gripped Brandon. It made her shudder. She lost track of how long she remained there, only that the light coming through the narrow cell window shifted from afternoon brightness to the dusky glow of evening. At times, she drifted into a half-sleep, haunted by ghastly images. Rhaegar's dying gaze loomed behind her eyelids, and she would jolt awake, heart pounding. The child within her felt like a living reminder of what she'd done. She whispered apologies into the darkness, though she did not know to whom. Rhaegar, Ned herself, or the thousands who had died in this war. The walls gave no reply. Night finally settled, and in the corridor beyond her cell, torchlight flickered on the walls. She heard footsteps approach again. This time, it was a lone set of steps, measured and light. She pushed herself upright, back against the damp stones. The door's lock clicked, and it swung open to reveal a woman she did not know. The woman wore a simple gown and carried a small lantern. Behind her, a guard lingered, hand on his sword, but he did not enter. The woman shut the door behind her, casting the cell in a warm glow. She was older, with lines around her eyes and a mouth turned down in concern. "My name is Eleanor," she said softly, setting the lantern on the floor. "I am a midwife. The Kingsguard have asked me to tend to you, see if you need anything for the babe. They told me." She hesitated, gaze flicking to the blood still caked on Lyanna's hands. Her expression was grim, but not unkind. "They told me what happened." Lyanna stared numbly, uncertain whether she should be grateful or suspicious. She felt exhausted to her core, every inch of her body aching. She wanted to keep the child safe, but the thought of a Targaryen midwife loyal to the old king filled her with weariness. She found her voice after a moment. "I'm not in labor if that's what they fear." Eleanor shook her head. "No, you're not. But stress can harm the babe. And there's enough stress here to break anyone." She knelt, opening a small pouch she carried. From it, she withdrew a skin of water and a rag. "You're covered in blood," she said gently, holding out the rag. Lyanna stared at her hands. The blood had dried to a brownish crust, flaking around her fingernails. Her gown was stiff with it. A wave of nausea threatened her again, but she forced it down. She accepted the rag and the water, scrubbing at her hands with shaky determination. Dark rivulets ran down her wrists and onto the floor. Eleanor watched, her eyes full of pity. When Lyanna finished, her hands were red raw from scrubbing, but at least the blood was mostly gone. Eleanor rummaged in her pouch, producing a small vial of some potion. "For calm," she said. "It won't harm the babe, but it'll help you sleep." She pressed it into Lyanna's trembling hand. Lyanna eyed the vial warily. "You serve the Targaryens," she said bluntly, voice hoarse. "Why would you help me after what I've done?" Eleanor sighed, settling onto her knees so they were nearly eye level. "I've served this fortress for many years under many lords and ladies. I serve the people within it, not just a house sigil. You carry an innocent life in you. If there's anything I can do to ease your suffering, or the child's, I will." "Sir." Lyanna could not find words for the gratitude and confusion warring within her. She nodded, feeling fresh tears threaten. Eleanor gently laid a hand on Lyanna's belly, as if checking for the child's movement. Lyanna tensed at first, but the woman's touch was light. She felt a slight flutter in return. It was the only piece of solace she could cling to, the knowledge that the babe still lived, still fought on in her womb. Eleanor stayed a few moments longer, asking if Lyanna felt any pain or discomfort aside from her obvious distress. Lyanna answered numbly, caught between the memory of Rhaegar's final moments and the terror of what might come next. The midwife offered no judgment, only a quiet compassion. When she finally stood, she set a small loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese beside the lantern. "Eat if you can," she said. "Try the potion. I'll come again in the morning." Then she left, closing the cell door behind her, the lock scraping once more. Lyanna gazed at the bread and cheese, stomach twisting with equal parts hunger and revulsion. She was not sure she could keep anything down, but after a moment, she forced herself to break a piece off and nibble. Each bite felt like she was swallowing broken glass. She managed half the loaf before her nerves made her stop. The child within her needed nourishment, she reminded herself. Everything felt overshadowed by the magnitude of what she'd done, but she would not let the babe suffer if she could prevent it. Eventually, she drew the vial from her pocket and stared at the amber liquid inside. Perhaps if she slept, she would escape the horrors for a few hours. Or maybe her dreams would only revisit them more vividly. She swallowed the potion in one gulp, grimacing at the bitter aftertaste, then slumped against the wall. As time crawled by, a sluggish warmth spread through her limbs, dulling the raw edges of her emotions. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she fell into a fitful slumber, the lantern's light flickering against the stones. She dreamed of Winterfell, of the courtyard blanketed in snow. She saw Ned there, looking at her with solemn gray eyes, beckoning her forward. She stepped into the snow, barefoot, her feet sinking into the cold. Then the scene shifted. Rhaegar stood beside Ned, a gaping wound in his chest, blood staining the pristine snow. He lifted his gaze, silent accusation in his eyes. Lyanna tried to speak, but her voice was gone, and the wind carried Ned's words in a whisper. "What have you done?" She reached out, but the snowfall turned crimson, swirling around her in a maelstrom of red flakes. She sank to her knees, and the dream dissolved into darkness. When she woke, the cell remained dark, except for the lantern's fading glow. She felt a dull ache in her back, and her throat felt parched. She shifted against the wall, stiff and sore from sleeping on cold stone. The child within her stirred, a faint kick to her ribs. She pressed a hand to the spot, tears slipping down her cheeks again. She could not say how many more tears she had left. Exhaustion weighed on her, but rest offered no relief. Hours must have passed. She heard muffled commotion outside, men's voices raised, footsteps echoing through the corridor. She wondered if news had reached King's Landing, if ravens now flew with messages proclaiming Rhaegar's death. She pictured Robert's face upon hearing it, the mix of triumph and bitterness. She imagined Ned's shock, the swirl of conflicting emotions. Would they rejoice that the Targaryen prince was gone? Or would they grieve the manner of his death? A pang tore through her. She did not want Ned to think her a murderer, though that was precisely what she had become. She drew her knees to her chest, trying to stave off the chill that coiled through her. Her thoughts drifted to the realm. She told herself that at least now, Robert's men would not have to battle Rhaegar on another field. Fewer soldiers might die. Perhaps the rebels would rally more quickly, converge on King's Landing and depose Aerys before he burned it to the ground. Perhaps she had saved thousands of lives. But in the silence of her cell, that hope felt insubstantial. The war might still rage. Aerys's madness might be unleashed in a final blaze of devastation. If so, had she accomplished anything? The dagger's stain on her soul would remain either way. She did not sleep the rest of the night. In the dim light before dawn, she heard more activity in the fortress above, the shift of guards, the low murmurs of conversation. She wondered if there would be a trial. Aerys might command they haul her to King's Landing, parade her as the murderer of the prince. She shuddered at the thought of that journey, of the possible cruelty awaiting her in the capital. She pictured the child forced to be born in some black dungeon, or worse, never born at all. Tears pricked her eyes again, but she had nothing left to sob. A hollow emptiness replaced her sorrow, an endless ache in her chest. Eventually, a guard came with water, passing it through the bars without meeting her gaze. She drank greedily, though it tasted slightly stale. Hunger gnawed at her, but no food was provided this time. She settled back against the wall, arms wrapped protectively around her midsection. Her gown was stiff and filthy, crusted with dried blood. She felt grimy, sweat-soaked, her hair plastered to her scalp. She wanted to wash, to rid herself of the stench of death. She wanted to vanish into the northern winds, far from this place, far from the guilt that clung like a shroud. The day wore on in that lonely cell, each minute elongated by the torment of her mind. She heard occasional footsteps, sometimes a single pair, sometimes multiple sets in hurried discussion, but no one came to see her. She wondered if the Kingsguard were arguing about how to handle her. She wondered if the fortress's servants whispered about the northern girl who had slain the dragon prince in cold blood. She pictured them spitting at her name, cursing her as the catalyst for all the bloodshed that had befallen the realm. And perhaps she deserved it. It was nearly evening by the time the midwife, Eleanor, returned. She brought another meager meal and a second vial of sleeping draught. Lyanna accepted them in silence. Eleanor offered a small cloth soaked in water so Lyanna could wipe her face and arms, an act of compassion that made Lyanna almost weep again. Eleanor asked gently about the babe, and Lyanna mumbled that it still stirred within her, that the pains were slight but constant. The midwife nodded, caution in her eyes. "You must keep your strength," she advised. "No matter what happens." Lyanna managed a hollow nod. She ate the bread and cheese again, forced down some water, and let Eleanor clean the dried blood from her hair with damp cloths. The midwife did what she could, but without a proper basin. It was a meager effort. Lyanna still felt unclean, but she whispered a soft thank you nonetheless. Eleanor left as quietly as she came, her face etched with sorrow. Night settled once more, bringing the fortress's hush. Lyanna stared into the lantern's flame until her eyes stung. She thought of Winterfell, of the crypts beneath where old Stark kings and lords lay. She thought of her mother's gentle hands, braiding her hair on cold winter mornings. She thought of Ned's serious face, how his eyes crinkled when he laughed. She missed them all so fiercely that her chest ached, as though an icicle had pierced her heart. Would she ever see them again? Would Ned even recognize her if she emerged from this fortress alive? She had changed too much. She pressed a hand to her belly. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the child, voice trembling in the cell's stillness. "I'm so sorry." All she could do was pray her desperate act might bring the kingdom a chance at peace, even if her own life was forfeit. She prayed that the child would not be condemned for the sins of its parents. And she prayed with a faltering hope that Ned would understand someday why she had done this. She had tried to save them all. In the dark of that second night, she took the sleeping draught again, grateful for any escape from the nightmares that stalked her while awake. She drifted into uneasy dreams, haunted by flickers of green fire, crumbling towers, and the howl of a distant wolf echoing through empty halls. When she woke near dawn, the cell remained silent. Another day loomed, bringing only uncertainty and the threat of the king's wrath. She stared at her hands, clean now but marred in ways unseen. It was done. There was no undoing it. She had killed Rhaegar Targaryen, and she would bear the consequences, whatever they might be. She wondered if the realm would remember her as a hero who sacrificed her love to end a war, or as a treacherous murderess who had plunged a dagger into the rightful prince. Perhaps they would call her both, or neither. In truth, the memory of her would never settle into a single shape. History would cast her in shadows. But for now, she had only this cold cell, the child in her womb, and the knowledge that she had crossed a line that no one could ever uncross. As the dawnlight crept through the cell's high window, she closed her eyes and let silence wash over her. One way or another, her own fate was sealed. All that remained was for the realm to decide what to do with Lyanna Stark, the woman who had slain a dragon for the sake of peace. Okay. She startled awake at some indeterminate hour, cramped limbs protesting as she shifted against the rough cell floor. Outside the barred window, a strange hush cloaked the fortress. No voices echoed through the corridors, and the usual shuffle of boots seemed absent. The silence unnerved her, as though the keep itself were holding its breath. She rubbed her eyes, still red and swollen from weeping, and felt the dryness in her throat. Her stomach rumbled with a hunger that churned her insides, though she had little appetite for anything. The child moved, pressing a tiny foot or elbow against her ribs, and she set a hand there, blinking back tears. She had killed Rhaegar Targaryen. The truth never ceased to strike with fresh force, like a repeated blow to her ribs. The magnitude of what she'd done had settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Somewhere in the fortress, his body likely lay in vigil, if the Kingsguard had performed their duties with the respect they always gave to royalty. A wave of sorrow came unbidden, so strong it left her chest tight. She wasn't sure if she would ever feel anything else again. She heard footsteps at last, several pairs, their tread brisk and purposeful. A jolt of foreboding ran through her. She pushed herself upright, pressing her palms to the cold stone behind her for leverage. The cell door clanked as a key turned in the lock. Then the heavy metal creaked open. Torchlight flickered from the corridor, illuminating two figures stepping inside. She recognized Sir Gerald Hightower first, his white cloak seeming drab in the gloom, and behind him trailed a lean man in dusty riding leathers, his face obscured by the shadows. A guard lingered outside, clearly tense, though he kept a respectful distance. She stared at the newcomer. As he moved into the cell, the torchlight caught the angles of his face. Dark hair, a trimmed beard, and keen gray eyes. Her throat tightened in a surge of mingled relief and fear. He was older than she remembered, the lines around his mouth deeper, the weight on his shoulders more pronounced. But she would have known her brother anywhere. "Ned," she breathed, voice rasping from disuse. Her heart pounded so furiously she thought it might burst. She wanted to fling her arms around him, to sob apologies into his cloak, but the gravity in his stare held her in place. He looked as though he scarcely believed what he was seeing. His gaze swept over her, noting her disheveled appearance, the dark stains on her gown. He seemed to age a year in that single breath, sorrow creasing his brow. She wanted to speak, but no words formed, so she simply stared, hands trembling against the stone floor. Sir Geralt cleared his throat, glancing between the siblings. "Lord Stark," he said, voice taut, "I've done as we agreed and brought you here, but mind you, this is a delicate matter. The king's men—" Ned held up a hand, silencing the king's guard with a soft command. "Leave us," he said, though his tone was measured, more request than demand. Sir Geralt hesitated, but a flicker of resignation in his eyes told Lyanna that the old knight had made some sort of bargain with Ned. Perhaps he had no choice, or perhaps he harbored his own regrets. Whatever the reason, he dipped his head and stepped out, closing the door behind him. The scrape of the lock followed, leaving brother and sister alone. A long silence stretched. She watched Ned carefully. He wore a travel-stained cloak, the direwolf of House Stark embroidered on his doublet. Dust covered his boots. He looked exhausted, yet within his gaze flickered an intensity that reminded her of the boy she once knew, the brother whose gentleness masked a core of unyielding steel. At last he spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "I came as soon as word reached us. Robert's men took the fortress gates last night, but I insisted we hold back until I saw you first." His words sounded drained, as if he'd repeated some version of these lines too many times in the last hours. He took a single step closer, frown deepening. "What happened, Lyanna? They said you—" He broke off, as if the truth itself were too monstrous to utter. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. "I did," she answered, voice trembling. "I killed Rhaegar." Her tone was hollow, an echo in the stale air. She expected Ned to recoil, to demand how she could commit such a crime, but he remained still. Slowly, she forced herself to look at him again. I believed it would end the war. I couldn't see any other way." Ned's jaw clenched, and he exhaled sharply, kneeling beside her. She could smell the sweat of the road on his cloak, the faint scent of horse and leather. For a moment, she feared he might strike her or shout. Instead, he gently took her hands in his. She felt the warmth of his touch, and a sob tore itself from her throat. He pressed a hand to her cheek, wiping away the tears that spilled forth. "My dear sister," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. "You've been so alone." Another pause, heavy with the weight of unspoken grief. Then he drew her into his arms, letting her bury her face against his chest. He smelled of the north, of winter winds and quiet forests. She clung to him, body shaking with sobs that refused to stop. Time slipped by as she cried. Ned held her, muttering half-formed words of comfort, though she scarcely heard them. Finally, she managed to catch her breath, pulling away to wipe her face. She noticed the dark wet patch on his cloak where her tears had fallen. She felt a flash of guilt, remembering how long it had been since they stood like this, siblings without war between them. Ned's eyes flickered to her abdomen, where the gown stretched slightly over the curve of her belly. She could see the question forming on his lips. "Is this Rhaegar's child?" he asked gently, though there was no judgment in his tone. She nodded, swallowing past a tightness in her throat. "Yes," she whispered. I'm sorry, Ned." His gaze softened. "You have nothing to apologize for." Then, a flicker of concern crossed his features. "Robert's men are here, Lyanna. If they learn whose babe you carry, I'm afraid they might. I don't know what Robert will do in his rage. Even if I can persuade him you were coerced or that you did this for the realm, His hatred for the Targaryens runs deep. Man. She closed her eyes, the terror of that truth pressing down on her. She had known it all along, but hearing it from Ned only confirmed how precarious her situation was. "We have to hide it," she said. "No one can know. If Robert even suspects." Ned nodded solemnly, finishing the sentence for her. "He'll see it as dragon spawn, an enemy's blood." His mouth pressed into a thin line. "The realm knows Rhaegar died, but not how. Many of the Targaryen loyalists fled the fortress as soon as our forces broke through the gates. The Kingsguard tried to hold them off, but it was chaos. Now." She felt a heavy dread settle in her gut. "What about the king?" she asked, recalling the glimmer of madness in Aerys's eyes, the rumors that he would burn King's Landing rather than surrender it. "Is he?" Ned sighed. "We had word that Tywin Lannister marched on the city. King's Landing has fallen. Aerys is dead. Jaime Lannister slew him." He paused, glancing at her face as though bracing for her reaction. "The city burned in parts, but not entirely. Robert's forces are moving in to secure it. I don't know all the details. Only that House Lannister has thrown its weight behind Robert, likely hoping to secure favor." She listened, absorbing each piece of news with a numb acceptance. She had long since lost the capacity for shock. The Targaryens had lost, one way or another. Aerys was gone, just as Rhaegar was gone. The line of dragons snuffed out, except for the child that stirred inside her. She shivered, thinking that the entire future of that bloodline now curled in her womb. It felt like too great a burden. Ned placed a hand on her shoulder. "We must leave here," he said quietly. "Sir Gerald has given me leave to take you, but I'm not sure how we'll get you past Robert's men if they learn the truth. He wants the name of every Targaryen supporter, every loyalist who might threaten his new reign." She nodded, her thoughts racing. "I won't resist. I just want to go home." The words emerged in a trembling rush. She wasn't even certain Winterfell was truly home anymore, but it was the only place that made sense. "Will Robert allow it?" A grave look darkened Ned's expression. "Robert will do as he pleases. He's named himself King of the Seven Kingdoms. With Tywin's backing, he can claim the throne. The Baratheon banners wave over King's Landing now, or so I hear." He paused again, eyes distant. "He's asked after you, of course. He wants you brought to the capital. He was furious when he learned that Rhaegar had hidden you away." His voice lowered, thick with tension. "He means to marry you, if you'll have him, as he always intended. He imagines you'll welcome it after what Rhaegar did." "Man?" Cold dread lanced through her. "Marry Robert?" She pictured his face. Hot-blooded, fierce, quick to laughter but also to anger. She recalled their betrothal feast in the north, how he'd boasted that she would be the most cherished lady in the realm. How she'd felt a flicker of unease even then. But that was another lifetime. "He won't want me when he learns I'm carrying Rhaegar's child," she said bleakly. "And if he does find out, he might kill it." Ned's mouth tightened. "He must never know," he said firmly. "We'll say you lost the babe during your captivity, or we'll hide the child away and claim it died at birth. Something, anything." He took a steadying breath. "We can't stay here though. Robert's forces will arrive by nightfall to secure the fortress. I can try to lead you north under guard, say it's for your health. But if Robert demands your presence in King's Landing, I can't refuse him without risking further bloodshed." She pressed her fingertips to her temple, trying to think clearly through the haze of exhaustion. Her body throbbed in protest, and the child shifted restlessly as if sensing her turmoil. "I'll go to King's Landing if I must," she said, fighting back the quiver in her voice. "But we have to protect this child, Ned. I couldn't stand to lose it as well." He hesitated, then nodded with a solemn vow in his eyes. "We will. On my honor." They rose together, and she wobbled, nearly collapsing from weakness. Ned steadied her, his arm firm around her waist. He escorted her out of the cell, moving slowly. The corridor beyond was dim, lit by guttering torches in wall sconces. Sir Gerald Hightower waited, eyes flickering between them. He gave Lyanna a strange look, contempt, regret, sorrow all mingled, but said nothing. He merely gestured for them to follow him. They made their way through winding corridors that smelled of dust and old stone, places that had once been richly decorated but now stood nearly empty. The hush was unsettling, broken only by distant shouts from outside, where Robert's men patrolled the fortress perimeter. Occasionally, they passed a body. Some unfortunate guard who'd resisted the rebels, or a Targaryen loyalist left behind. Lyanna's stomach twisted each time. She had grown accustomed to the smell of blood, and she despised that fact. They came at last to a modest chamber, likely once a storeroom. Within waited a group of men bearing the sigil of House Stark. Ned's own men, no doubt, wore the gray direwolf on their tabards. One stepped forward, face grim with concern, and bowed his head to Ned. "My lord," he said, then turned to Lyanna with equal respect, though pity lurked in his gaze. "We are prepared to escort you wherever you command." Ned inclined his head, guiding Lyanna into the room. "Gather supplies for the road," he ordered quietly. "We make for Harrenhal first. I'd have liked to ride directly north, but Robert's demanded a gathering of all the major lords to recognize him as king. So we'll be forced to pass near the capital." His voice lowered at the last part, betraying his unease. Lyanna listened, heart pounding. She felt so utterly powerless. She remembered the days when she would ride her horse across the frozen fields of Winterfell, reckless and free, and the memory seemed a distant dream now. The possibility that she might have to stand before Robert, that he might insist on marrying her, twisted her stomach in knots. But worse still was the fear for her unborn child. She gently lowered herself onto a small bench while Ned conferred with his men. Sir Geralt lingered near the door. His white cloak was stained with dust and flecks of dried blood, no doubt from the fighting that had taken place when Robert's vanguard stormed the fortress. She could sense his grief, though he kept his composure. Rhaegar had been his prince, and Lyanna was the reason that prince now lay cold and lifeless. She half expected him to draw his sword and be done with her. Yet he did nothing, only fixed her with a haunted stare. Ned noticed and approached him, voice low. Lyanna strained to hear. "You have my gratitude for allowing me to see her," Ned said. "But what will you do now? You've lost your prince. Will you remain with the King's Guard in King's Landing, or do you mean to vanish like the rest of the Targaryen loyalists?" Sir Geralt's expression tightened. "My vows bind me to the crown, whoever wears it," he replied. "Robert Baratheon sits the Iron Throne now, or soon will. If he'll have me, I'll serve. If not..." He trailed off, letting the silence speak for him. Ned studied the older knight for a moment. "I do not envy you," he said softly. "But know this, Lyanna is under my protection. Let no harm come to her. The deed is done, and the war must end. If Robert thirsts for vengeance, I'll do what I can to shield her." Sir Geralt's jaw worked, and he gave a stiff bow of his head. "She is lucky to have a brother such as you." There was no warmth in his words, but neither was there open hostility. Ned returned to Lyanna's side, leaning down to speak in a hushed tone. "Can you ride?" he asked. "We'll need to depart soon before Robert's main host arrives. If we're fortunate, we can avoid any direct confrontation until we're closer to Harrenhal. That might buy us time to decide our next steps." She took a trembling breath. "I can try," she said. "But if we ride hard, I might slow you down." The child within her made lengthy journeys difficult. Ned glanced at one of his men, who seemed to guess his lord's intention immediately. "We have a litter, my lord," the man said. "It's not large, but it'll be more comfortable for the lady." Lyanna felt relief flood her. It would be humiliating to be carried, but better than being jolted in the saddle for days. "Thank you," she murmured. They wasted no time. The Stark men hustled to prepare the litter, and soon Lyanna found herself walking unsteadily through the fortress courtyard, which was now littered with the aftermath of battle. Shattered weapons, bloodstains, burnt debris. A warm wind blew across the dusty ground. She noticed a few of Robert's banners hanging limply along the perimeter. Men in Baratheon livery patrolling with watchful eyes. They seemed to pay little attention to her at first, more concerned with claiming the fortress's storehouses. But she could sense their suspicion. The sideways glances. One recognized Ned Stark, inclining his head in wary respect. She climbed into the small litter, wincing at the pain in her stiff muscles. Ned busied himself, ensuring the horses were well shod and that their meager supplies were secured. He'd insisted on paying respects to the dead, but time was short, so he dispatched a few men to see that bodies were moved respectfully out of the sun. She wondered if Rhaegar would be given a proper pyre, or if Robert would demand his head displayed as a trophy. The thought made her shudder. She pressed a hand to her stomach, suppressing the wave of nausea. At last their makeshift party set forth, exiting the fortress gates under the watch of Robert's sentries. They did not challenge Ned's departure, likely because the main force had not yet arrived to impose stricter measures. Lyanna peered through a gap in the litter's curtains, glimpsing the rocky landscape of Dorne stretching away under a merciless sun. Small ridges of red rock shimmered in the heat, the horizon wavering in the distance. The first few days of travel felt surreal. Lyanna dozed fitfully, lulled by the swaying of the litter, only to jolt awake each time by nightmares of Rhaegar's final breath. The road north was rough, and though Ned's men did their best to shield her from the worst of the jolts, her back ached constantly. Each day was an exercise in endurance as she wrestled with guilt and fear. Occasionally, Ned would ride beside her litter, speaking softly through the curtains to inquire about her health. She offered short answers, not sure how to voice the turmoil inside her. They had not spoken about the details of Rhaegar's death since leaving the fortress, as if it were too raw for either of them to broach. They kept away from major towns, taking back roads and lesser-used passes whenever possible. Word of Rhaegar's demise had spread swiftly. The Targaryen cause had all but collapsed. Small folk greeted Ned's party with wary curiosity or cautious relief, uncertain whether these northern soldiers meant peace or further bloodshed. Lyanna rarely emerged from the litter, both to hide her identity and because she felt too drained to face the looks of strangers. She heard rumors from the men that Elia Martell and her children had been slain in King's Landing, that Tywin Lannister's men sacked the city with cruel abandon, that Robert now wore the crown. Each rumor felt like a twist of the knife in her chest, reminding her that, in the end, even Rhaegar's death had not prevented all horrors. On the 10th day, as they drew closer to the Riverlands, Ned reined in his horse near midday and dismounted by the litter. She heard his step outside, the soft clink of his sword belt. He parted the curtains, allowing a gust of fresh air to enter. She sat up carefully, adjusting the cloak that concealed her pregnant belly from prying eyes. He looked drawn, deep shadows under his eyes. "We're a half-day's ride from Harrenhal," he said. "We'll set camp soon. I fear we can't avoid the main roads any longer. Robert's riders are said to be patrolling. We'll need to show ourselves or risk being taken for deserters." He hesitated, glancing at the men around them. "Best you remain hidden in here once we near the castle. I'll see if I can arrange a discreet entry. I'm not sure who commands Harrenhal now. After the tournaments and the war, the castle's changed hands more than once." She nodded, feeling a swirl of anxiety. Harrenhal. The sight of that fateful tourney where Rhaegar had crowned her the queen of love and beauty. 1,000 memories pressed in, reminding her how one moment of admiration had sparked an inferno. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. "I'll do as you say," she murmured. "Just keep me safe." He gave her a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. "I promise," he said, voice quiet. "You're all I have left, Lya." They resumed their journey, merging onto a broader road that wound along a muddy river. The air grew muggy, thick with insects buzzing in the reeds. Late summer heat pressed down on them, and the men cursed as they swatted at gnats. The child within her twisted uncomfortably, and she tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself that soon they would find shelter, that perhaps a bed awaited her behind some castle walls instead of the endless jostle of the litter. As dusk fell, the towers of Harrenhal rose in the distance, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Their blackened spires, warped by dragonfire long ago, gave the castle a sinister cast. Lyanna peered through the crack in the litter's curtains, swallowing back apprehension. She had once danced in that courtyard, had once worn a crown of blue roses from the hand of a silver-haired prince. Now she returned, carrying that prince's child, a tarnished memory of broken dreams. Ned rode ahead with 2 of his men, leaving the rest of the party to await whatever arrangement he could make. The minutes crept by. Lyanna's nerves frayed. The baby kicked at her ribs, as though complaining about the confinement. At last, Ned returned with a retinue of unfamiliar soldiers, all wearing the banner of House Sweat, a black bat on a field of gold. The Lady Went had once held Harrenhal, but the castle had passed between many lords since. Lyanna could not track the changes. The soldiers escorted them inside the sprawling gates. Beyond lay a courtyard large enough to host armies. In the fading light, she glimpsed walls scorched by ancient dragon flame and towers that loomed like dark monoliths. Harrenhal was half ruin, yet it was still the greatest castle in the Riverlands, imposing and drenched in sorrow. They came to a halt near a corner of the courtyard where stable hands milled about, gawking at the newcomers. Ned dismounted and murmured instructions to have the litter moved inside a less conspicuous entrance. Lyanna stayed curled in the shadows, her heart hammering. She heard the hush of whispers. "Lord Stark is here. Did you see the Stark banner?" Something about a lady in the litter. Rumors stirred like leaves in a gale. She clenched her hands, trying to will her anxiety into submission. At length, the litter moved again, borne by 2 sturdy grooms up a ramp and through a side passage. Torches flickered in sconces, revealing a vaulted corridor that smelled of mildew. Harrenhal's vastness pressed in around her. She closed her eyes, recalling the place in more splendid times. Now it felt like a mausoleum. Eventually, they stopped in a small antechamber, where Ned and the middle-aged steward in dusty robes stood waiting. The steward directed them to a modest suite of rooms, likely reserved for lesser lords or important guests when the castle was full. It contained a single large bed with worn linens, a wooden table, a few chairs, and narrow windows overlooking a courtyard, choked by weeds. The walls dripped with damp, and cobwebs clung to the rafters. Still, it was better than a cell. Lyanna allowed the grooms to help her from the litter, leaning on Ned's arm for support. The steward bowed and made to leave, promising to send food and water. Once the door shut, Ned guided her to the bed. She sank onto it with a sigh, wincing at the twinge in her back. He crouched beside her, brow furrowed. "I'll stay with you tonight," he said softly. "Tomorrow, I must see about an audience with whoever currently rules in Robert's name. Possibly Lord Walder Frey or some such. The politics are complicated, but one thing is sure. Word of Rhaegar's death is traveling, and everyone wants to know who ended him." "Not." She swallowed, guilt crashing anew. "If Robert finds out, I can't imagine what he'll do." Ned reached for her hand, gently covering it with his own. "We'll keep it secret. If I must, I'll say he died in the battle for the fortress. There were so many scuffles. Who can say how the final blow was struck?" He tried for a reassuring smile, though it was a pale attempt. "Eat something if you can. Then you should rest. The babe is nearly due, isn't it?" She nodded mutely. "A few more moons," she whispered, not entirely certain of her calculations. Time had blurred in the fortress, and stress had disturbed her sense of her own body. But she knew it was close. The child would come soon, and that thought terrified her. Would it have silver hair or dark? Would it cry for a father it would never meet? Ned squeezed her hand, then rose. "I'll see about water and fresh clothes," he said. "Try to sleep once you've eaten." He left, and Lyanna was alone in the dim chamber. She let her gaze wander over the stones, cracked and damp with a faint odor of decay. A small candelabra on the table provided the only light. She reached up to unfasten her cloak, letting out a soft groan as she shifted her weight. The babe gave a spirited kick, and she rubbed the spot, murmuring a quiet hush. "We're safe for now," she said, unsure she believed it. Just a little longer. A knock on the door preceded the arrival of a servant bearing a tray of food. Stew that smelled passable, a small loaf of bread, and a wooden cup of thin ale. Lyanna thanked the girl in a hoarse voice, and the servant dipped a quick curtsy before scurrying out. She forced herself to eat, though every bite tasted like ash. The guilt coiled in her stomach, refusing to leave. Her thoughts wandered to Eleanor, the midwife who'd tended her in the fortress. She wondered if the woman had escaped, or been taken by Robert's men. She whispered a silent prayer that the gods would spare the kind soul. The stew warmed her belly at least, and fatigue began to settle in her bones, heavy and insistent. She set the tray aside and managed to remove her boots, grimacing at how swollen her ankles had grown. Leaning back against the thin pillows, she closed her eyes and drifted in and out of uneasy slumber. Each time she neared sleep, a memory of Rhaegar's face, bloodied and stunned, wrenched her awake. She clenched her jaw against a scream that wanted to tear free. Her hands shook. Sometime later, Ned returned with a basin of tepid water, a cloth, and a bundle of clothes. She roused herself enough to wash away the grime of travel, moaning quietly as the water stung the raw patches of skin. Ned stood by, awkwardly averting his gaze. She couldn't meet his eyes either, the shame too great. At last, she donned a fresh gown, one that stretched over her belly more comfortably, and sank back onto the bed. Ned took a seat in a rickety chair nearby, resting his forearms on his knees. He spoke of his plans. How in the morning he would meet with the current Castellan to negotiate a safe passage, or at least some arrangement for them to continue. He hoped to keep the news of Lyanna's presence quiet, but rumors might already be spreading. "I have to approach this carefully," he said, voice low. "Robert's men might be on their way, expecting a formal surrender of Harrenhal. If they find you here, if he insists you return to King's Landing with him." He trailed off, tension clear in his features. Lyanna nodded, a dull dread in her chest. She picked at the bedding, trying to calm the tightness in her throat. "If he does, I'll go," she said, voice small. "I'll face him if I have to. I only beg you. Help me protect the child." Ned reached over and clasped her hand gently. "Always," he murmured. "You're my sister, and this babe is blood of my blood. We Starks stand together." She managed a wan smile. Then she released a shuddering breath, gaze drifting to the shuttered window. A faint patter told her that rain had begun to fall. The gloom felt fitting, as if the sky itself wept for the realm. They spoke little more that night. Ned eventually dozed off in the chair, and Lyanna succumbed to an uneasy, dream-filled slumber. Morning came with a gray light filtering through the shutters. She woke, heart pounding after another nightmare. Ned stirred in his chair, grimacing at the stiffness in his neck. A knock sounded at the door, heralding the steward's reappearance. He informed them that the Castellan, an aging cousin of the Went line, would meet Lord Stark in the Great Hall. Ned rose, splashed water on his face, and then offered Lyanna a reassuring nod. "Stay here," he said. "I'll return soon." She waited, pacing restlessly around the chamber. Her ankles ached, and she found her breath coming in short gasps, as if the walls were closing in. She forced herself to sit by the window, inhaling the damp morning air, blinking at the silhouette of Harrenhal's shattered towers. A part of her wanted to venture out into the courtyard, to stand beneath those towers, and remember the girl she'd been, but fear of recognition kept her rooted to the spot. After what felt like hours, Ned returned, relief and worry mingling in his face. "We may have a few days' respite," he told her. "The Castellan doesn't want trouble. He'll shelter us for the moment, but word is that Robert himself rides this way to secure oaths from the local lords. We can't hide your presence for long." He raked a hand through his hair. "I'm not sure if we have time to slip away without raising suspicion." She felt the walls press in again. "Does that mean I must face him soon?" she asked, voice unsteady. Ned nodded grimly. "Yes. I doubt we can avoid it." Then, seeing her distress, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever happens, remember this. You are my sister, a Stark of Winterfell. Robert once loved you. Maybe that love will temper his anger enough to let you live in peace, though I can't say the same for the truth about the child. We must keep that a secret at all costs." She stared at the stone floor, the emptiness in her chest growing. The day she had once dreaded, reuniting with Robert, was imminent, yet it felt no less unreal than a nightmare. The memories of his boisterous laughter, his strong arms around her waist, blurred with the image of him as a furious conqueror. She wondered which side of him would greet her now. The next 2 days passed in a nerve-wracking limbo. Harrenhal's labyrinthine corridors offered plenty of places to hide, and Ned tried to keep her out of sight, but rumors inevitably spread. She occasionally glimpsed retinues of soldiers arriving, bearing different house sigils: Bracken, Blackwood, Freydiana. They came to pledge loyalty to Robert's new regime. She heard the clang of arms in the courtyard as knights trained for the battles that might still loom if any Targaryen loyalists rose. She was washing at a small basin on the second evening when Ned knocked quietly and entered, expression solemn. "Robert is here," he said, shutting the door behind him. He arrived at dusk with a large escort. "They've just finished dining in the Great Hall. I've spoken to him alone. He wants to see you." Her stomach turned to lead. She gripped the basin's edge, water dripping from her fingertips. She glanced at the small mirror that hung crooked on the wall. The reflection that stared back was hollow-cheeked, eyes ringed with shadows, hair limp and dull. She barely resembled the spirited girl Robert had once courted. Perhaps that was for the best. Ned approached, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He doesn't know you're with child," he assured her in a low voice. "I told him you'd been ill, that you lost a babe you'd conceived from your captivity. I'm sorry," he added, voice thick with sympathy. "I had to say something to explain your appearance. He asked if Rhaegar forced you, and I—" She closed her eyes, feeling tears threaten again. "It's fine," she whispered. "Let him believe what he will." Ned gently handed her a clean cloak and helped her fasten it over her shoulders, arranging it so the folds hid the swell of her abdomen. Her heart pounded as they left the chamber. Torches lit the corridor, revealing glimpses of passing guards who bowed to Ned and cast curious glances at her. They made their way through the winding halls to a smaller solar near the Great Hall. 2 Baratheon men-at-arms stood at the door, each bearing the crowned stag on their surcoats. One of them knocked, and a deep voice from within commanded entry. Ned squeezed her hand in wordless encouragement, then opened the door. The solar was dimly lit by a few candles on a round table, and a fire smoldered low in the hearth. Robert Baratheon stood on the far side, staring into the embers. He wore dark leather breeches, a black tunic emblazoned with the Baratheon stag, and a heavy gold-trimmed belt. He turned at their entrance. He was larger than she remembered, broad through the shoulders, with a bit more flesh around the waist. His black beard was thick and untrimmed, framing a face that bore new lines of anger and sorrow. His eyes, once filled with a youthful spark, now carried a hardness born of war. She felt her pulse hammer, uncertain how to greet him. He dismissed Ned with a curt nod. "I'll speak to her alone," he said, voice holding none of the jovial warmth she recalled. Ned hesitated, glancing at Lyanna. She gave him a slight nod, unable to speak. Reluctantly, Ned stepped out, leaving them together. Robert stood there, gaze raking over her. She could see a flicker of emotion cross his features, pain, longing, perhaps fury. Then he closed the distance in 3 strides. His hands grasped her shoulders, not roughly, but firmly enough that she felt trapped. She looked up, meeting his dark eyes, tears already threatening to spill. "Gods, Lyanna," he said, voice raw with a swirl of anger and relief. I thought you were dead." His fingers tightened, and she bit her lip. A wave of conflicting emotions coursed through her. Guilt, sorrow, a strange spark of tenderness for the man he once was. She managed to speak, voice shaking. "I was gone, but not dead. I'm sorry." He exhaled sharply, a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob, and pulled her into his arms. She stiffened, uncertain how to respond. The smell of ale and sweat clung to him. She let herself be held, her face pressed into the scratchy fabric of his tunic. For an instant, she could almost pretend they were young again, betrothed and hopeful. Then reality crashed back. Rhaegar's death, the war, the child in her womb. Nothing was the same. He held her for a moment longer, before releasing her, stepping back to look at her face. "I'll kill every last Targaryen for what they did," he growled, voice trembling with rage. "I heard you lost a child. Ned told me. Did that bastard prince, did he force himself upon you?" His eyes flared, raw hatred shining there. She hesitated, swallowing hard. "I don't want to speak of him," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "He's gone now. Let the war end." Robert's jaw tightened. He deserved worse. He spat. "He stole you from me, started this whole bloody war. Half my friends are dead because of him. And you—" He lifted a hand to her cheek. Gentler this time. "They said you'd been ill. You look so thin, Lyanna." She forced a trembling breath. "I've been through much," she said, sidestepping the truth that she had wielded the blade. "I only want peace." A flicker of something like tenderness passed over his features. "Then you shall have it," he declared, voice still resonant with that old Baratheon confidence. "I'm king now. No man will dare harm you. You'll be my queen, as was always meant to be." "Maybe." Her stomach twisted, a fresh wave of panic crashing through her. "Queen D'Artois." The word felt like a chain around her throat. She opened her mouth, struggling to find a response. "Robert." He silenced her by lifting a hand, as though the matter was settled. "We'll wed soon," he said. "Once you've recovered, I'll see you properly cared for, new gowns and all the finery you deserve. The realm will rejoice. The wolf and the stag, united. We'll show everyone that House Baratheon and House Stark remain strong together." Lyanna. She closed her eyes, unable to deny him outright, without arousing suspicion. If she refused him, might he suspect the child's true lineage? Fear for the babe gripped her. A half-lie formed on her lips. "I'm still weak," she said softly. "I need time." He nodded, face softening. "Take all the time you need," he said. "We'll have a grand feast in King's Landing. The people will welcome their new queen, the bride who was stolen from me by that serpent. And if any Targaryen stragglers remain, I'll send them to the grave." He paused, eyes searching her face. "I missed you, Lyanna," he murmured, voice cracking at the last word. "You were all I thought about when we stormed those battlefields, that I'd find you, bring you home." She lowered her gaze, the guilt so sharp she thought she might bleed from it. "I'm here now," she said, voice shaking. She could not bring herself to say anything more. He took her hand, and she let him, though a chill crawled over her skin. "Rest," he commanded gently. "We'll speak more tomorrow. I'll have the maester see to you, and I'll post my best men outside your door to ensure no one disturbs you." He seemed to interpret her trembling as mere fragility from her ordeal. She wanted to tell him she was trembling because of him, because of what he might do if he discovered her secret. He pressed a kiss to her knuckles, then stepped away, his gaze lingering. "Sleep well," he said, as if they were parted lovers in some courtly romance. A sour taste filled her mouth. He strode to the door, tossed a brusque command at the guards outside to keep watch, and left. She stood there, heart thudding in her chest. Queen D'Artois, wife to Robert de Whitehain, the father of her child's murderer, if the truth ever emerged. She sank onto a small bench, pressing her hands to her face, fighting the sob that rose in her throat. How could she possibly navigate this? If she refused him outright, he might suspect the truth. If she agreed, she would be lying every day of her life, terrified of discovery. And what of the child, who would one day be born with or without Targaryen features? A dread deeper than anything she had known settled over her. Ned came in a short while later, looking worried. She stood, meeting him with a gaze full of anguish. "He wants to marry me," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "He says he'll kill any Targaryen he finds. If he learns about the babe—" Her voice trailed off, tears threatening. Ned closed the door, crossing to her side. He placed a comforting hand on her arm. "He won't find out," he said firmly. "We'll keep it hidden, no matter what it takes." He glanced at the door. "But for now, you must play along. I'm sorry. It's the safest path." "Mean?" She swallowed, nodding, though her mind screamed at the wrongness of it. "Hell want the wedding soon," she said, dread lacing each word. "And once we're wed, how will I hide a child that's nearly due?" She dared not think of the heartbreak if the babe inherited the silver hair of House Targaryen. Ned ran a hand over his face. We'll find a way. We might arrange a ruse. That you're too ill to consummate the marriage for a time. Perhaps that you need bed rest. That the stress of your ordeal has made the maesters cautious." He set his jaw. "We must protect you and the babe. The war may be over, but your battle is not." She sank onto the bench again, shaking her head. "What if the babe is born with the look of the dragon? I can't." She pressed trembling fingers to her lips. She recalled the stories of how Targaryen children sometimes looked more Valyrian than Westerosi, with silver gold hair and purple eyes. Her chest tightened painfully. Ned knelt beside her, voice gentle but resolute. "If that happens, we'll say it died at birth and hide it away. I'll claim it as mine, or we'll send it far from Robert's reach. Something, anything, to keep it safe." She could hear the anguish in his voice. He was forging plans from desperation, no more certain of success than she was. But he was trying. Fresh tears streaked her cheeks. She nodded, clasping his hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm sorry for all this." He hushed her, shaking his head. "No apologies. We do what we must. We Starks protect our own. We always have." She gripped his hand, tears slipping freely now. "I killed him, Ned," she whispered, the guilt surging. "I thought it would end the war. But even now, the horrors continue. The city was sacked. Elia Martell was murdered. Her children. Rhaegar's children." She couldn't finish, a sob choking her throat. Ned closed his eyes, pain evident. "Those were Tywin's men, not yours," he said. "Their cruelty lies on their heads, not yours. You acted to spare thousands more lives in battle. No one can say how many were saved because Rhaegar did not lead another army into the field. But I believe you did what you thought was right." She let out a trembling sigh. "I only pray the gods forgive me if they still listen at all." He squeezed her hand once more, then stood. "Try to rest," he repeated. "Robert will expect to see you tomorrow, perhaps to parade you before his lords. Show them the prize he's reclaimed. I'll be here when you wake." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He stepped out, leaving her alone with her spiraling thoughts. The child in her womb shifted again, perhaps sensing her distress. She curled onto the small bed in the corner of the solar, hugging a pillow against her body. The flicker of candlelight cast dancing shadows on the damp stone walls, shapes that reminded her of swirling flames. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come easily. Instead, she lay there, mind churning with visions of crowns and swords, of Robert's fierce eyes, of Rhaegar's final breath. She stroked her belly, whispering silent promises to the unborn life, vowing to keep it safe at any cost. Through the long hours of the night, she listened to the soft crackle of the dying fire, waiting for dawn and the next trial fate would demand. And somewhere beyond the castle walls, the realm shifted under a new king, the fires of war still smoldering, even as the last dragon had been extinguished by her trembling hand.